How did you respond when you learned what your stepdad's photography hobby actually was? I found the first SD card in the laundry room on a Thursday afternoon in October. It was sitting on top of the dryer in a small plastic case labeled October Beach Shoot in my stepdad Kenneth's handwriting. I was 16 and doing my laundry before basketball practice. The case was open and the card had fallen out onto the machine. I picked it up to put it back and noticed Kenneth had left his laptop open on the folding table where Mom sorted clothes. The screen showed a photo editing program with thumbnails visible. I glanced at them while closing the case. The images showed the public pool where I lifeguarded over the summer. Dozens of photos taken from the parking lot with a zoom lens. Kids in swimsuits, families, teenagers. Nothing that looked illegal exactly, but something about it felt wrong. Why would Kenneth photograph random people at the pool? I put the SD card back in its case and left it on the dryer. At dinner that night, Kenneth mentioned he'd been working on a new photography project documenting community spaces. Mom smiled and asked to see the photos. Kenneth said they weren't ready yet, that he was still editing and organizing them. He'd been into photography for 2 years since marrying Mom. He had expensive cameras and lenses that filled a shelf in his home office. Every weekend he'd disappear for hours claiming he was shooting landscapes or architecture. The next week I found another SD card in Kenneth's car. I'd borrowed his sedan to drive to my friend Austin's house because my truck was getting new tires. The card was in the center console under some receipts. This one was labeled September Park Series in the same handwriting. When I got home, I plugged it into my computer and opened the files. The photos showed Riverside Park, specifically the playground area. More zoom lens shots taken from a distance. Children on swings. Kids climbing the jungle gym. Parents pushing strollers. Every photo focused on children between roughly 5 and 12 years old. My stomach turned over. I scrolled through 200 photos, all taken over multiple days based on the changing weather and clothing. Kenneth had spent hours sitting somewhere in that park with a telephoto lens pointed at children. I ejected the card and put it back in his car the next morning before school. During lunch, I sat in the cafeteria trying to convince myself there was an innocent explanation. Maybe he was documenting childhood for some art project? Maybe he had permission from the parents? But if that was true, why hadn't he mentioned any of it? Why the secrecy? 2 weeks after finding the second card, Kenneth left his office unlocked while he took a shower. I knew I had maybe 10 minutes. I went in and found his filing cabinet where he stored SD cards, 3 drawers full of labeled cases. June elementary field day. August splash park. July soccer tournament. Every label. Referenced locations where children congregated. My hands shook as I pulled out random cards and read the labels. May dance recital. April library story time. March school pickup. He'd been doing this for months, maybe longer. I heard the shower turn off upstairs and quickly closed the cabinet. Kenneth had photographed children systematically at dozens of locations over an extended period. This wasn't a hobby. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all those SD cards and what might be on them. I thought about Kenneth working at the middle school with access to hundreds of kids every day. At 2 a.m, I got up and Googled, photographing children without permission legal. The results were complicated. In public spaces, photography was generally legal even without consent. But the pattern I'd seen, the systematic targeting of children, the secrecy, all of it pointed to something predatory. The next day was Saturday. Kenneth left at 9 a.m. with his camera bag. Mom went grocery shopping an hour later. I went into Kenneth's office and took 10 SD cards from different months. I brought them to my room and spent 3 hours going through every photo. The pattern was undeniable. Hundreds of photos of children at public locations. Many were taken with zoom lenses from concealed positions, parking lots, behind trees, through fences. Kenneth had been hiding while he photographed kids who had no idea they were being watched. Several folders contained photos that made my stomach drop. Children at the public pool changing area photographed through gaps in the fence. Kids at the elementary school playground shot through the chain link from the street. Close-up images of specific children's faces taken with a telephoto lens from far away. I found a folder labeled Favorites with subfolders for different kids. Each subfolder had a first name. Sophia folder, Liam folder, Ava folder. Inside were dozens of photos of the same children taken at different locations over weeks or months. Kenneth was tracking specific kids, following them, learning their routines, and photographing them repeatedly. This wasn't just random photography. This was surveillance. I copied everything onto an external hard drive and put the SD cards back in Kenneth's office before Mom got home. I needed to tell someone, but I didn't know who. If I told Mom, she might not believe me. Kenneth was her husband, and she loved him. I called my dad, Sunday afternoon. He lived 2 hours away in Clayton, and I saw him every other weekend. I told him I needed to talk about something serious involving Kenneth. Dad told me to come over immediately. I drove to his apartment and showed him everything on the external hard drive. Dad's face went hard as he scrolled through folders. He said we needed to contact the police right away, that this was predatory behavior, even if it wasn't technically illegal yet. He called a lawyer friend named Gerald, who specialized in family law. Gerald came over that evening and reviewed the evidence. He said the systematic targeting of children and the favorites folders suggested Kenneth had inappropriate interest in minors. The photos taken through fences and gaps showed intent to photograph children in private or semi-private moments. Gerald said we should report everything to both the police and the school district where Kenneth worked. Gerald drafted a formal complaint that night. Dad called the police Monday morning and filed a report. Detective Raymond Cooper was assigned to the case. Detective Cooper met with us Monday afternoon at the police station. He was in his 40s with gray hair and a serious expression. He reviewed everything I'd brought and asked detailed questions about Kenneth's patterns and behavior. I described finding the SD cards and what I'd seen in the favorites folders. Detective Cooper's jaw tightened when I showed him the photos of specific children taken at multiple locations over time. He said this looked like a predator building a collection and potentially planning escalation. He needed to move fast before Kenneth realized anyone was investigating. Detective Cooper contacted the school district's administrative office and spoke with the superintendent. He explained the situation and requested Kenneth be placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. The superintendent agreed and said they'd remove Kenneth from campus that afternoon without explanation. Detective Cooper also contacted the FBI because possession of certain types of images could be federal crimes. He wanted a forensic team to examine all of Kenneth's computers and storage devices. He asked if I could help them get access to Kenneth's office. I said yes. We planned a search warrant execution for Wednesday morning when Kenneth would be at school, before he knew he'd been suspended. I went home Monday night and pretended everything was normal. Kenneth came home from school and talked about his day. Mom asked about his photography plans for the weekend. Kenneth said he was thinking about shooting at the downtown farmers market. My skin crawled listening to him talk about his next hunt. Wednesday morning arrived cold and gray. Mom left for work at 8. Kenneth got a call from the school at 8:30 asking him to come in for a meeting with the superintendent. He left immediately, confused, but not suspicious. 20 minutes after he drove away, Detective Cooper arrived with 4 other officers and a warrant. I let them in and showed them to Kenneth's office. They seized his computers, his filing cabinets full of SD cards, his external hard drives, and all his camera equipment. The search took 2 hours. Detective Cooper told me they'd analyze everything and contact me with updates. He also warned me that when Kenneth found out about the investigation, he might become dangerous or try to flee. He gave me his direct number and told me to call immediately if Kenneth acted, threatening. The officers left, and I waited for what would happen next. Kenneth came home at noon. I was in my room when I heard the front door slam. He yelled my name. His voice had an edge I'd never heard before. I came downstairs and found him standing in the hallway outside his office. The door was open and the room was empty. Everything had been taken. Kenneth's face was red and his hands were clenched into fists. He asked what the hell happened to his office. I told him the police had been there with a warrant. His expression shifted from confusion to rage in seconds. He asked why the police were here and what I told them. I said I found his SD cards and saw what he'd been photographing. Kenneth went very still. Then he said I had no right to go through his private property, that I'd violated his privacy and destroyed his art project. He claimed he was documenting childhood in America for a photography exhibit. I told him the favorites folders weren't art, they were surveillance. Kenneth's face went pale. He realized I'd seen everything. He told me I'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd done nothing wrong and I'd just destroyed his reputation. He said Mom would never forgive me for this. Then he grabbed his wallet and keys and walked out. He drove away and didn't come back. Mom called me at 3 that afternoon. Her voice was shaking. The school superintendent had contacted her about Kenneth being placed on administrative leave due to a police investigation involving inappropriate conduct with minors. Mom demanded to know what was happening. I told her everything. The SD cards, the folders, the photos of children taken from hiding spots, the systematic stalking of specific kids. Mom went silent on the other end. Then she started crying. I sent her some of the photos I'd copied. She called back 10 minutes later sobbing. She said she was coming home immediately. When Mom arrived, she looked 10 years older. Her makeup was smeared from crying and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She asked to see everything. I showed her the external hard drive with all the folders. She went through them slowly, her face getting paler with each new discovery. When she reached the favorites section with photos of individual children tracked over months, she had to run to the bathroom. I heard her getting sick. She came back 20 minutes later and said we needed to call the police. I told her Detective Cooper was already investigating. Mom called her lawyer and filed for emergency divorce. She wanted Kenneth's name off everything we owned. Detective Cooper called Thursday morning. Kenneth's computers had been seized and the forensic team found exactly what they expected. Thousands of additional photos of children stored in encrypted folders. Many of the images were taken at Kenneth's school. Students in hallways, kids during recess, close-ups of specific girls photographed repeatedly over the school year. They also found online accounts Kenneth used to communicate with other people who shared his interest in children. He'd been part of forums where people traded techniques for taking photos without being noticed. He'd shared some of his own images with these groups. Detective Cooper said Kenneth was being charged with multiple felonies, including possession of images taken in violation of privacy laws and using his position at the school to access minors for exploitation. Federal charges were pending based on what they found in his online accounts. Cooper said Kenneth hadn't returned home and his phone was turned off. He'd likely fled once he realized the investigation was happening. An arrest warrant was issued, and Kenneth's information was sent to law enforcement agencies across the state. Cooper wanted Mom and me to stay vigilant in case Kenneth tried to contact us. The local news covered Kenneth's case Friday evening. They didn't name him yet because charges were still being filed, but they reported that a middle school teacher had been suspended for inappropriate photography of students. Parents at Kenneth's school began calling each other in panic. By Saturday morning, Kenneth's name had leaked online. Social media exploded with outrage. Former students came forward saying Kenneth had always made them uncomfortable. A girl named Claire posted that Kenneth used to photograph students during class, claiming he was documenting teaching methods, but he'd focus his camera on specific girls for long periods. Her parents had complained to the principal 3 years ago, but nothing happened. Now everyone realized the warning signs had been there all along. The school district released a statement saying they were cooperating fully with law enforcement and conducting an internal review of their policies. Parents organized meetings demanding accountability. How had Kenneth been allowed to photograph students for years without oversight? Why were complaints dismissed? The superintendent faced calls to resign. The whole community was in chaos. Mom stopped going to work. She stayed home crying and apologizing to me for bringing Kenneth into our lives. I told her she couldn't have known. Kenneth was arrested Monday morning at a motel 200 miles away in Westfield. Police had tracked his credit card usage and found him registered under his own name. He didn't resist arrest. Detective Cooper called to tell us Kenneth was in custody and being transported back for arraignment. The charges included 15 counts of unlawful surveillance, invasion of privacy, and exploitation of minors. The FBI was filing additional federal charges related to his online activities. Kenneth faced decades in prison if convicted on everything. The arraignment happened Wednesday afternoon. Mom and I attended. Kenneth was brought into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed. He looked smaller than I remembered. His lawyer argued for bail, claiming Kenneth wasn't a flight risk despite having fled initially. The prosecutor presented evidence that Kenneth had been planning to leave the state permanently. They'd found plane tickets to Mexico on his laptop and research about countries without extradition treaties. The judge denied bail. Kenneth would stay in jail until trial. As they led him out of the courtroom, Kenneth looked directly at me. His expression was cold and hateful. Mom squeezed my hand and we left quickly. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. They shouted questions about whether we'd known about Kenneth's activities. The investigation expanded over the next month. Forensic analysis of Kenneth's devices revealed he'd been engaging in this behavior for at least 5 years, long before he married Mom. He'd worked at 3 different schools in 2 states during that time. Detectives in those jurisdictions opened their own investigations. Multiple families came forward with concerns they'd raised years ago that were ignored by administrators. One mother said Kenneth had volunteered to chaperone a field trip to the zoo and spent the entire day photographing her daughter instead of supervising the group. She'd complained to the school and was told Kenneth was just enthusiastic about photography. Another parent said Kenneth offered to do a free photo shoot of their son for a school project, then asked inappropriate questions about the boy's schedule and activities. The pattern of ignored warnings was extensive. Kenneth had relied on people dismissing concerns as overreactions or misunderstandings. He'd used his position as a teacher to deflect suspicion. The exploitation had been hiding in plain sight. The FBI uncovered Kenneth's involvement in a larger network of people who shared illegal content. His online accounts showed he'd been active in forums for 8 years. He'd communicated with dozens of others who traded images and techniques. Several of those people were arrested in coordinated raids across multiple states. The investigation became national news. The prosecutor's office contacted me in December, asking if I'd testify at Kenneth's trial. They wanted me to explain how I discovered the SD cards and what I found. My testimony would establish the timeline and show Kenneth's systematic behavior. I said yes. The prosecutor, a woman named Veronica Hale, met with me twice to prepare. She explained that Kenneth's defense would try to paint me as a troubled teenager who invaded his privacy and misinterpreted innocent photos. They'd claim I had ulterior motives for wanting to destroy his relationship with my mother. Veronica said I needed to stay calm and stick to facts. She walked me through the questions she'd ask and the likely angles Kenneth's lawyer would take. I understood the stakes. Kenneth's conviction depended partly on my testimony establishing the foundation of the investigation. Kenneth's trial began in late January. The courthouse was packed with reporters and concerned parents. Mom and I sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table. Kenneth sat with his defense attorney, a man named Philip Cross. The jury selection took 3 days. Veronica's opening statement laid out the prosecution's case. She described Kenneth as a predator who'd spent years systematically photographing children in public and at his school. She explained how he'd tracked specific kids across multiple locations and maintained detailed folders organized by child. Philip's opening statement claimed Kenneth was a passionate photographer interested in documenting American childhood in the digital age. He said Kenneth's photos were taken in public spaces where there was no expectation of privacy. He claimed the favorites folders were simply Kenneth organizing his best work by subject. I testified on the second day. Veronica walked me through finding the first SD card and my growing concerns as I discovered more. I explained why I'd gone into Kenneth's office and what I found in the filing cabinets. I described the favorites folders with individual children tracked over months. Veronica showed the jury printouts of some photos, children photographed through fences, close-ups of faces taken with zoom lenses from far away. The jury looked disturbed. Philip's cross-examination was aggressive. He asked why I'd gone through Kenneth's private property without permission. I said I'd seen enough to know something was wrong and needed to protect those children. He suggested I resented Kenneth for marrying my mother and wanted to destroy their relationship. I said Kenneth destroyed the relationship himself by stalking and photographing children. Philip asked if I understood the concept of public photography being legal. I said legal doesn't mean appropriate, and tracking specific children across multiple locations wasn't normal photography. Philip tried to rattle me for 40 minutes, but I stuck to the facts. When I stepped down, Veronica squeezed my shoulder and whispered that I'd done great. The prosecution called Detective Cooper next. He testified about the search warrant execution and what the forensic team found. Thousands of photos of children stored on Kenneth's devices, encrypted folders requiring passwords, online forum accounts where Kenneth communicated with known offenders. The detective showed the jury chat logs from Kenneth's online accounts, messages where Kenneth asked others for advice on avoiding detection, posts where he shared photos of kids from his school. The jury looked sick. The prosecution called several parents whose children appeared in Kenneth's favorites folders. Their emotional testimony made the impact clear. These weren't abstract legal questions. Real children and real families had been violated. The prosecution's final witness was an FBI agent named Lawrence who specialized in crimes against children. He testified about the online network Kenneth had been part of. He explained how these groups operated and the progression from innocent public photography to more serious exploitation. He said Kenneth's behavior fit the classic pattern of someone escalating. Without intervention, Kenneth would have continued and likely escalated to more serious crimes. Kenneth testified in his own defense against Philip's advice. He claimed his photography was misunderstood. He said he'd been documenting childhood in America for a photography exhibit he'd planned to submit to galleries. Veronica's cross-examination destroyed him. She asked why his art project required encrypted folders and password protection. She asked why he researched countries without extradition treaties if his photography was innocent. She showed the jury Kenneth's chat logs, discussing how to photograph children without parents noticing. She read messages where Kenneth expressed attraction to specific kids and asked for advice on approaching them. She asked why he fled when police executed the search warrant if he'd done nothing wrong. Kenneth had no answer. His testimony lasted 3 hours, and he looked defeated when he finally stepped down. Closing arguments happened on a Friday afternoon. Philip argued that Kenneth's photography fell within legal bounds and the prosecution hadn't proven criminal intent. Veronica's closing was powerful. She reminded the jury about the favorites folders tracking individual children over months. She showed them the photos taken through fences and gaps, demonstrating Kenneth's intent to photograph kids in private moments. She read Kenneth's messages about specific children and his research into avoiding detection. She asked the jury to use common sense. Did Kenneth's behavior look like innocent documentary photography or systematic stalking? The jury got the case at 4 that afternoon and deliberated through the weekend. The verdict came back Monday morning. Mom and I returned to the courthouse with Detective Cooper and Veronica. The courtroom filled quickly with parents, reporters, and concerned community members. Kenneth was brought in looking pale and thin. The judge called the courtroom to order and asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The foreperson stood and said yes. The clerk read the charges one by one. Count 1, unlawful surveillance, guilty. Count 2, invasion of privacy, guilty. Count 3 through 15, various charges related to exploitation and inappropriate contact with minors, guilty on all counts. Kenneth showed no emotion, but his shoulders slumped. Mom grabbed my hand and started crying. The sentencing hearing arrived in March. The judge allowed victim impact statements before imposing sentence. 5 families gave statements describing how Kenneth's actions had affected them. Each statement was devastating. Kenneth stared at the table in front of him throughout the testimony. When it was my turn, I walked to the podium and read the statement I'd prepared. I said Kenneth had violated the trust of an entire community. He'd used his position as a teacher to access children and his marriage to my mother to establish credibility. He'd spent years systematically stalking kids while pretending to be a normal member of society. I asked the judge to impose the maximum sentence to protect kids from Kenneth ever doing this again. The judge listened carefully to everyone. Then she addressed Kenneth directly. She said his behavior represented a profound betrayal of every value teachers were supposed to uphold. She said his systematic stalking of children showed clear predatory intent regardless of whether he'd physically touched anyone. She sentenced Kenneth to 25 years in state prison on the combined charges. With the federal charges pending, Kenneth would likely spend the rest of his productive life incarcerated. The community response after sentencing was intense. Parents organized to push for policy changes in the school district. The superintendent, who'd allowed complaints about Kenneth to go unaddressed, resigned under pressure. The school board unanimously passed new policies requiring any staff member who wanted to photograph students to get explicit written permission from parents and administration. They created an anonymous reporting system for concerns about staff behavior. They mandated annual training on recognizing signs of predatory behavior. The federal trial happened in May. Kenneth was transported from state prison to face charges related to his online forum activities. The evidence was overwhelming. The federal jury convicted him on all charges after just 4 hours of deliberation. The federal judge added 15 years to run consecutively with his state sentence. Kenneth would be incarcerated for 40 years total. He'd be 75 when released if he survived that long. Detective Cooper called to tell me about the federal sentencing. He said Kenneth would never hurt another child. The investigation had also led to arrests of 23 other people across the country who'd been part of Kenneth's online network. Cooper said my decision to investigate the SD cards and come forward had protected countless children. I'd broken up a network of predators. Life slowly returned to something resembling normal over the following months. Mom sold our house because neither of us could stand living in the place Kenneth had operated from. We moved into an apartment closer to Mom's work. I finished my junior year of high school and tried to focus on normal teenager things: basketball, college applications, hanging out with Austin and other friends. But I'd changed. I couldn't see the world the same way anymore. I noticed things other people missed. My therapist said hypervigilance was a common trauma response. Senior year brought new challenges. Some kids at school treated me differently after everything became public. A few guys acted impressed that I'd caught a predator. Others avoided me. Most just moved on with their own lives. I wasn't looking for attention or recognition. I just wanted to graduate and move forward. College applications forced me to confront what I'd learned about myself through this experience. I wrote about discovering evil hiding in my own home and having to make the choice between staying silent or protecting others. Several universities accepted me. I chose one 3 hours away, far enough to feel like a fresh start, but close enough to visit Mom regularly. I started college with mixed feelings, excited for independence and new experiences, but carrying the weight of what I'd been through. My roommate was a friendly guy named Derek from upstate who wanted to study engineering. He didn't know anything about my history with Kenneth, and I didn't volunteer the information. It felt good to be somewhere nobody knew my story. I threw myself into classes and activities, made new friends who didn't associate me with scandal and trauma. I graduated college 4 years after Kenneth's sentencing, with a degree in criminal justice and a minor in psychology. I decided during sophomore year that I wanted to work protecting children the way Detective Cooper had. The state police hired me as an analyst focusing on crimes against children. My job involved reviewing evidence, identifying patterns, and supporting detectives during investigations. The work was emotionally difficult, but deeply meaningful. Every case I helped solve meant children removed from danger and predators held accountable. I worked at the state police for 3 years before moving to a federal position with an agency focused specifically on online exploitation. I thought about Kenneth often in this work, how his case had started with a single SD card and grown into a federal investigation that dismantled an entire network. That pattern repeated in many of my cases. Someone noticed something wrong and had the courage to report it, setting in motion investigations that saved lives. 20 years after finding that first SD card in the laundry room, I stood in a university auditorium addressing 300 students studying criminal justice and social work. I told them Kenneth's story from beginning to end, how I'd found the SD cards, what I'd discovered, the decision to report everything despite not knowing if I'd be believed, the investigation and trial and Kenneth's conviction. I described the 23 other arrests that came from dismantling his network. I explained how the case had changed school district policies and inspired families to be more vigilant. The students listened intently. During Q&A, someone asked if I'd ever regretted reporting Kenneth given how much pain it caused my family. I said no. My family's pain would have been worse if I'd stayed silent and Kenneth had eventually escalated to physical crimes. Another student asked what advice I'd give to people who suspected someone might be harming children. I said trust your instincts. Don't talk yourself out of concerns because you don't want to cause problems. Report suspicions to authorities and let them investigate. Better to be wrong and embarrassed than right and silent while children are harmed. Mom called me one evening that same year with news that Kenneth had died in prison. Heart attack during recreation time. He was 66 years old and had served 20 of his 40-year sentence. I said honestly that I felt relief. Kenneth would never hurt another child. His victims could truly move on knowing he was gone. One moment of courage had created waves that spread far beyond what I could see or measure. Kenneth was gone now, but the children were safe. That's what mattered most. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.